1331. Claude responded, in 1878, a man walked into the land office in Dodge City, Kansas, and tried to file a homestead claim on 160 acres of open. In 1878, a man walked into the land office in Dodge City, Kansas, and tried to file a homestead claim on 160 acres of open grassland. The clerk looked at his paperwork. The paperwork was in order. The man had met every legal requirement. The clerk told him the land was already spoken for. It was not. The man was black. He walked out with nothing. The land sat empty for another 2 years. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is the story of what really happened when black Americans tried to build something permanent in the West. If this is the history that actually explains why things are the way they are today, subscribe. We don't stop at the surface here. And before we go any further, do you have any family history connected to the westward migration, black or otherwise? Tell us in the comments. Because what black settlers attempted in the American West, and what was done to stop them, is one of the most important stories in American history that almost nobody knows. Now, the popular story of black Americans in the West goes like this. After the Civil War, some formerly enslaved people went west and found freedom. A few became cowboys, a few became lawmen. The West was rough, but it was open, and open meant equal, and equal meant a chance. That is the version most people carry. It is not wrong exactly. It is incomplete in ways that change everything. Because what actually happened was this. Tens of thousands of black Americans looked at the West in the years after the Civil War and saw exactly what the popular story says they saw. Possibility. Land. Distance from the plantation system and the people who ran it. A place where the past did not have to define the future. They moved. They built. They organized communities from nothing. They established towns, churches, newspapers, schools. They created something real. And then the same forces that had always constrained them followed them west and began dismantling what they had built. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic event, slowly, systematically, through legal mechanisms and economic pressure and violence, and the quiet daily application of a racial hierarchy that did not stop at the Missouri River just because the geography changed. That is the real story. And it starts earlier than most people think. Before the war ended, before the great westward migrations of the 1870s and 80s, black people were already present in the West in significant numbers. Enslaved people had been brought to Texas by slaveholders moving their operations beyond the reach of federal pressure. Enslaved people had been brought to California and other western territories by men who expected the frontier to operate on the same terms as the South. Free black people had come as miners, as traders, as members of expeditions, as the wives and partners of frontiersmen of every background. The West was not a white space that black people entered. It was a multiracial space that a white narrative tried to make exclusive after the fact. But here is where the scale of the post-war migration becomes important. Because what happened in the late 1870s was not a trickle. It was a wave, and the wave had a specific cause. Reconstruction was ending. The federal troops that had been stationed in the South to protect formerly enslaved people and enforce the amendments that gave them citizenship and rights were being withdrawn. The withdrawal was a political deal, the details of which were negotiated by men in Washington who were not themselves at risk from what the withdrawal would mean. What it meant on the ground in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia was the rapid, violent reassertion of white supremacist control. The system that had lost the war was winning the peace. Black Americans in the South in 1877 and 1878 faced a choice: stay and face what was coming, or move. Many moved. They moved west. A family in Mississippi in the spring of 1879 sells everything they can sell and packs what they can carry and joins a group of several dozen families heading to Kansas. The father has heard that Kansas has homestead land. He has heard that Kansas has a Republican government that is more favorable to black settlers than anything available in Mississippi. He has heard from other men who have made this trip that it is possible out there to own land. Not to work land, to own it. He does not know exactly what he is going toward. He knows exactly what he is leaving behind. This was not one family. This was 60,000 people in a single year. 60,000? Moving out of the Deep South toward Kansas and other western territories in a migration that historians eventually named the Exoduster movement, after the biblical Exodus and the dust of the trail. The scale of it shocked everyone, including the Kansas communities that were supposed to receive them, and including the men back in the South who had not anticipated this particular response to their reassertion of power. A town in Kansas in the spring of 1879 watches wagon after wagon arrive from the east, full of families who have been traveling for weeks, who are exhausted and have almost nothing left, who need food and shelter and land and work immediately. The town was not prepared. There is no infrastructure for this. Local relief organizations form on the spot. Churches open their floors. Farmers offer work in exchange for supplies. The arrivals keep coming faster than anyone can process them. Some of the arrivals make it to homestead land. Some do not. Some settle in towns. Some die of the diseases that travel with any large migration of exhausted people through inadequate conditions. But enough survive to plant something real. Enough survive to build. And what they build is extraordinary. The black towns of the West, and there were many of them, more than most people have any idea, were not makeshift camps or desperate improvised settlements. They were planned communities, built with intention and sustained by people who understood exactly what they were trying to create and why. A group of black settlers in Oklahoma Territory in 1891 lays out the streets of a new town. They have done the legal work. They have filed the claims. They have pooled money to purchase equipment and materials. The town is planned with the same care that any town is planned: grid streets, lots designated for business and residence, space reserved for a church and a school. These people have not stumbled into settlement. They have organized it. Within 3 years, the town has a newspaper. Within 5, it has a bank. Within a decade, it has everything that a functioning American town is supposed to have. And this is where the story turns, because every time something like this was built, it attracted the attention of the people who did not want it to exist. The threat was not imaginary. A thriving black town was a political statement. It was evidence that the argument being made across the South that black Americans were incapable of self-governance, incapable of building, incapable of functioning without white supervision, was false. Every successful black town was a refutation of that argument, and the people whose power depended on that argument understood this. But here is the problem. The tools available to dismantle black success were substantial and varied. The most basic was legal. Land claims were contested through the courts, and the courts were run by white judges applying laws written by white legislators. A black homesteader whose claim was challenged could not count on the legal system to function neutrally. He could file, he could appeal, he could do everything the law required and still find that the decision went against him in ways that had nothing to do with the merits of his case and everything to do with who was making the decision. A black farmer in Kansas in 1883 has been working a claim for 4 years. He has built a house, dug a well, broken ground on 50 acres, and developed the land in every way the Homestead Act requires. A white neighbor files a competing claim, arguing that the original filing was defective on a technical point. The case goes to the land office. The land office rules against the black farmer. He appeals. The appeal takes 2 years and costs money he does not have. The final decision goes against him. He loses the land he has been working for 4 years. The neighbor moves onto the property. The house the black farmer built is still standing. The legal system was one tool. The financial system was another. Black settlers who wanted to expand their operations, to buy more land or better equipment, or to build the kind of commercial infrastructure that would make a community stable, needed credit. Credit came from banks. Banks in Western territories were run by white men who made lending decisions based on their own assessment of risk and their own social and racial assumptions. A black farmer or businessman applying for a loan was applying to a gatekeeper who had every structural incentive to say no. This was not always overt. It did not need to be. A loan officer who simply found reasons to decline black applications. The collateral was insufficient. The plan was not sufficiently detailed. The applicant did not have the right kind of references, could operate entirely within the normal language of business while systematically denying capital to an entire community. Without capital, growth was constrained to what could be built from savings alone. Savings accumulate slowly. The white communities around black settlements, with access to credit, could grow faster. The gap between them widened over time in ways that looked like natural economic difference and were actually the product of a rigged system. A black merchant in an Oklahoma Territory town in 1895 has a successful dry goods store. He wants to expand. He has been in business for 6 years. His books are in order. He goes to the bank in the nearest white majority town, 15 miles away, because there is no bank in his own town yet. He presents his case. The loan officer reviews it carefully. He is told his collateral is insufficient. He knows men with less collateral who have gotten loans from this bank. He knows this because he has talked to them. He does not say this to the loan officer. He says, "Thank you," and drives his wagon home. He does not expand. The opportunity passes. Now here is something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss black settlements in the West. The deliberate construction of competing white towns in the same area, with railroad access and legal advantages built in, designed specifically to ensure that black towns would remain economically marginal. The railroad was the defining infrastructure of the late 19th century West. A town with a railroad connection had access to markets, to supplies, to people, to everything that made commerce possible at scale. A town without a railroad was isolated, limited, and ultimately unlikely to survive economic competition with towns that had connections. Railroad routes were not determined by geography alone. They were determined by the men who owned the railroads in negotiation with the men who owned the land through which the routes ran, in the context of political relationships that were themselves racially structured. A black town that needed a railroad connection had to negotiate with an industry controlled by white men who had their own interests and their own assumptions about which communities deserved access. In territory after territory, railroad lines were routed around black towns. Not always, not universally, but often enough that it became a recognized pattern. The white town 10 miles away got the station. The black town remained a day's wagon ride from the nearest connection to the outside world. Over time, that difference in access compounded into a difference in viability. A black town in Oklahoma Territory in 1900 has been in existence for 12 years. It has everything a town is supposed to have except a railroad. The nearest station is 8 miles away, in a white majority town that has been growing steadily since the line went through 6 years ago. Merchants from the black town drive 8 miles to ship their goods. The cost and time of that trip eats into their margins. Customers who want to shop conveniently go to the town with the station. The black town's commercial base slowly erodes. It does not die immediately. It takes a generation, but it does not survive as the thriving center its founders intended. That is not an accident. It is a policy outcome. And this is where things change, because the end of the frontier era and the formalization of statehood across the West did not improve conditions for black communities. In most cases, it made them worse. When territories became states, they wrote constitutions and passed laws. Those laws encoded racial hierarchies in ways that the more fluid territorial period had sometimes allowed to be circumvented. Oklahoma, which became a state in 1907, immediately passed laws segregating its schools, its public accommodations, its transportation systems. The black towns that had been built in part on the promise of territorial openness now found themselves governed by a state apparatus that was explicitly committed to their subordination. Think about what that meant for the people who had built those towns. They had spent decades creating something. They had worked within the law, followed the rules, built institutions, educated their children, accumulated what property they could. And then the law changed around them, not to protect what they had built, but to constrain it further. A man who has lived in an Oklahoma Territory town for 20 years, who helped found it, who has watched it grow from a handful of families to a real community, sits in his house in 1907 and reads the new state's laws. He has voted before. He will not be able to vote effectively under what is coming. His children's school is now legally separate and legally unequal. The pharmacy in the white town, where he sometimes gets supplies, now has a counter where he is not permitted to sit. He has been here for 20 years. The state has been here for 2 months. The state is already telling him who he is. He does not leave. He has nowhere to go that is better. He stays, and he works, and he continues building what he has always been building, under conditions that are harder than they were before. That persistence, that refusal to stop building under conditions designed to make building impossible, is the central fact of this history. And it is almost never centered in the popular narrative. But it gets worse, because for some communities, the harassment and legal pressure and economic constraint were not enough for the people who wanted them gone, and those communities faced something more direct. Violence against black settlements in the West was not rare. It was documented. It happened in ways that range from targeted attacks on individual families to organized campaigns against entire towns. The threat of violence was itself a constant pressure, shaping decisions about where to settle, how visibly to succeed, how loudly to assert rights. A family that built something knew they might have to defend it. And defense, for black settlers in the American West, was complicated by a legal framework that did not protect them equally. A black farmer in Texas in 1886, who arms himself to defend his property against men who have threatened him, is in a position where using those arms, even in clear self-defense, will result in his prosecution, while his attackers walk free. This is not hypothetical. It is the documented pattern of how the legal system operated in case after case. The law that theoretically protected everyone differently in practice. So the farmer makes a calculation. He can be armed and risk prosecution. He can be unarmed and risk attack. Neither option is good. He chooses one and lives with the uncertainty. His neighbor, in the same situation, chooses differently, and the outcome is different. There is no version of this that is safe. Now let us talk about what happened to the towns themselves, because the story of black towns in the West is not only a story of external pressure, it is also a story of remarkable internal achievement of communities that created cultural and intellectual and economic life of real depth and sophistication, and of what happened when that achievement was directly destroyed. The most complete and devastating example happened not in the frontier era, but in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood district of Tulsa was known as Black Wall Street. It was the most prosperous black community in the United States. Hotels, law offices, medical practices, retail stores, a film studio, a school system. It was exactly what the vision of black Western settlement had always promised, a community that had built itself from nothing into something genuinely impressive. In May and June of 1921, it was destroyed, not gradually, not through economic pressure or legal manipulation. It was burned to the ground by a white mob supported by the state National Guard, which dropped incendiary devices on the district from airplanes. 300 people were killed. 35 blocks were reduced to ash. 10,000 people were made homeless in 16 hours. The men and women who had built Greenwood over 30 years watched it burn from the edge of town where they had been forced at gunpoint. Afterward, the survivors were prevented by local ordinance from rebuilding on the same land. The legal mechanism that was supposed to protect property was used to prevent its restoration. The insurance claims were denied. The perpetrators were never prosecuted. No one went to prison for the destruction of a city neighborhood and the killing of 300 people. For decades, this event was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It was not in most American history textbooks. The people who survived it were told, in the most direct way possible, that what had happened to them did not officially count. A woman who survived the Tulsa massacre is living in a smaller Oklahoma town in 1950. She is in her 60s. She has rebuilt her life, as people do, because rebuilding is what you do when you have no other option. She does not talk about 1921 to her grandchildren, not because she has forgotten, because she does not want them to carry it in the specific way she carries it. She wants them to build, not to grieve. She knows they will need all their energy for building. She died with the memory. Her grandchildren learned it later from historians, not from her. That choice, to protect the next generation from the full weight of the past, is itself a kind of inheritance, and it is one reason why the history stayed hidden for so long. The survivors protected their children from it. The people who had perpetrated it were not interested in recording it. The official history simply moved on. Here is the question worth sitting with, the one that cuts through all of this. The towns got built. Despite everything, they got built. The farms got established. The schools got opened. The newspapers got published. Despite legal barriers and financial exclusion and violence and deliberate infrastructure denial, black Americans in the West built things that were real and substantial and in many cases extraordinary. How did they do it? The answer is not a single thing. It is a combination of factors that together constitute a kind of collective genius for survival under impossible conditions. The first was mutual aid. Black communities in the West created formal and informal networks of economic cooperation that functioned as an alternative to the white-controlled financial system that excluded them. People lent each other money. Businesses extended credit to community members who could not get it from banks. Labor was shared at no cost when a neighbor needed help building or harvesting. The community functioned as its own small economy within the larger one. A building goes up in a black Oklahoma town in 1897. 12 families provide labor on alternating days for 3 weeks. No money changes hands. The family that will live in the house has pledged their own labor to the next 3 building projects in the community. The system works because everyone in it understands that their individual survival depends on collective function. This was not charity. It was economics. And it was sophisticated. The second was education. Black communities in the West prioritized schools with an intensity that reflected their understanding of what education meant in their specific situation. A community with educated people had lawyers who could navigate the legal system. It had teachers who could train the next generation. It had people who could write, who could argue, who could document, who could make the case for their own rights in language the surrounding society had to acknowledge. A school opens in a black Kansas town in 1882. It has 1 room and 1 teacher and 40 children in mixed grades. The teacher works for a salary that is significantly lower than what white teachers in the same territory earn for the same work. She works anyway. She teaches reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, including a history that the official curriculum does not include, the history of her students' own people. She does this because she understands that what she is doing is not just education, it is armor. Her students become lawyers, teachers, farmers, business owners, and parents who send their own children to school. The third factor was documentation. Black newspapers in the West recorded what happened. The black press of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is one of the most important historical archives available to researchers today, precisely because it recorded events and perspectives that the white press either ignored or distorted. When a land claim was wrongly denied, when a business was burned, when a family was driven from their property, the black press wrote it down. Not always immediately, not always safely, but it wrote it down. A newspaper editor in an Oklahoma Territory town in 1899 writes an editorial about a land dispute in which a black family has been dispossessed through what he can demonstrate was a fraudulent legal process. He names names. He publishes evidence. He knows there will be consequences for this. He publishes anyway. Because if he does not write it down, it will not exist. And if it does not exist, it will happen again to the next family with no record of the pattern. He is right about the consequences. There are consequences. He is also right that it needed to be written down. And here is the final thing that this history demands we acknowledge. The towns that survived, the communities that persisted, the families that held on through all of it, they did not survive by being passive. They did not survive by keeping their heads down and waiting for conditions to improve. They survived by fighting. Not always with weapons, though sometimes with those too, but with law, with money, with organization, with documentation, with the deliberate, sustained application of collective intelligence to the specific problem of how to build something permanent in a world actively trying to prevent it. A group of men in a black Oklahoma town in 1910 meets in the back room of the general store. They are discussing the latest legal challenge to the town's incorporation status. A white majority county commission has raised a procedural objection that, if upheld, would dissolve the town's legal identity and make its land claims vulnerable. The men in this room are a farmer, a teacher, a merchant, and a minister. None of them are lawyers. But one of them has a nephew who trained as a lawyer in Kansas City, and that nephew has agreed to come and look at the paperwork. They pool money for the nephew's travel. They gather every document they have. They build the strongest case they can from the materials available. The procedural challenge is eventually rejected on technical grounds. The town remains incorporated. They did not win because the system worked for them. They won because they worked the system harder than the people trying to use it against them. That is the real story of black Americans in the Wild West. Not the exception, not the footnote. The central, ongoing, exhausting, often invisible, sometimes violent, ultimately unfinished project of building a life in a country that had been designed to make that building impossible. The towns are mostly gone now. Some were destroyed directly. Some were slowly emptied by the 20th century's migrations toward industrial cities in the North and West. Some survive in reduced form, the proud infrastructure of an earlier era slowly returning to the earth for lack of resources to maintain it. A few have been formally recognized and studied. Most have not. But they were real. The people who built them were real. The work they did was real. And the forces that were deployed against them were real, which means that what those people accomplished, despite those forces, was not ordinary. It was extraordinary. And now you know a version of the Wild West that the movies will never show you. Not because it is too dark, but because it is too true. The frontier was not a white man's world. It was everyone's world, and everyone fought for their place in it. Some had the law and the money and the guns of the state on their side, and some had only their own hands and their own will and the specific human refusal to stop building just because someone wanted them to stop. The people who kept building anyway deserve to be remembered. Now you know why they were forgotten, and now you know what they built.